All Things Alice. This podcast will explore the cultural phenomenon of Alice in Wonderland as artistic landmark and global symbol of inspiration and imagination. I'm your host, Frank Beddor, the author of the Looking Glass Wars Trilogy. Let's explore, what is it about Alice? So today's guest is Brian Flora. This guy has a huge imagination. He's an art director and concept artist, and he's had a remarkable career over 25 years, and he's done a lot of work on the Looking Glass Wars. So I'm thrilled to have him here because he's done everything from classic matte painting to working on all sorts of cutting-edge technology. Brian has worked on some very big films that you all will recognize: Batman Returns, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Blade Runner 2049, Beowulf, and The Matrix Reloaded. I mean, he's just worked on a lot of big movies. He's also done tons of cinematics for video games, and he's worked in theme parks. I'm just delighted to have him here and to chat about the images and his love of storytelling. He's very passionate. It's been a joy to collaborate. And now we get to hang out and chat about all things Alice. Brian, it's great to have you on the podcast. I've been really excited to reconnect with you. It's been, as you just pointed out, over a decade, which is shocking, but it's been 2 decades since we were introduced. And I'll just tell the listeners that originally the first concept artist that I worked with was Doug Chang, and I had asked him to help me sort out what those card soldiers would look like. And the experience was so positive because in the writing of the book, having this image on the wall of how the card soldiers were articulated got me really excited about the rest of the world. And so I said to him, "Hey, do you do environments?" And he said, "No, but I know just the person you should work with. And it's a colleague of mine, Brian Flora." And I said, "Great." And so you are the second artist. And because you were so good at capturing the essence of what was in my mind and what I was trying to put on the page, when you did some of those early sketches, they came back and I said, "Oh, he's in my head." And that's when we started to work together. And so having a real strong visceral reaction to you as a person and the conversations that we had about creating this artwork, and then the end result has gotten me really excited to say hi again, to re-engage, and to have this conversation. So welcome.
Yeah, it's great for me also to kind of look back and revisit that time, just because it was somewhat early in my career, and it was a very creative time for me. It was, I think when we started, it was before I had kids. And so I was still, there's a big change that happens in life where, at least for me, before I had kids and had to become responsible, I was always in my head dreaming, and it was just such a good time to get started on all of that. So.
Yeah, well, I think that's also an interesting point, is that our lives have been parallel pretty much in the kid department. I didn't have kids either, and writing seemed so much easier back then. I had all day, every day to myself. And once the kids came along, those 24 hours shrank down to about 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. So you probably experienced the same thing.
Yeah, well, and what's funny is, and I mentioned a minute ago before we started recording that I was revisiting the story, and I thought, there's the whole part of the story where Alice is in England and she begins to lose her creativity, becomes insecure, and in a way becomes a responsible adult, right? And it's such a good allegory for creativity.
Yeah, I like that analogy because when people talk about imagination, they often ask, where does it come from? And, things pop into your head. And if you're receptive, everything is out in the world, can be part of an imaginative life. But as kids, you're often told to sort of, fit in and, wear your hair this way and dress this way. And when I was a kid, I had a lot of that because my parents wanted a sort of presentation. And so I wanted to write about that because when you're a kid, you're so imaginative and you go off on these crazy tangents, and we can lose that as an adult. But if you're creative, you have to have that. And that's what separates creative people as adults and what they do, other folks who do other kinds of jobs. So it's, I don't know, did you notice in having kids any sort of imaginative spark come back where you were receiving it from them, reading stories or having them riff on something?
I think for me, it was observing it secondhand and just watching the delight that they would experience with their kind of naive but optimistic view of everything. They're just open, right, to whatever they pick up. So I think that was really inspiring.
Like I was saying, we have these parallel lives in terms of work, in terms of kids, and it's been these 2 decades. But can you refresh my memory? You were working with Doug. Were you working at ILM? Or
I was actually
Image Movers.
I had worked with Doug on Star Wars Episode 1, and then I was working for a time with him a bit, but then also with a company called The Orphanage. And I think that's when I was working on your stuff. So it kind of went through The Orphanage that you hired me.
Oh, really? Because Scott Stewart. I became friends with Scott Stewart.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And The Orphanage at the time was doing advertising, or were they doing visual effects? All visual effects. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I ended up having a nice relationship with Scott because he was aspiring to be a director, and he moved down here, and they had a production company, and we tried to get a movie going at one point. So, okay, The Orphanage.
Cool.
But you've worked at all these cool places because you worked at Image Movers on a couple of movies, and you worked at DreamWorks, and you've worked at ILM, and
I was at Atomic Fiction for about 3 years as their art director. So worked on The Walk, which was the Robert Zemeckis movie.
Right. Oh, that one. Oh, yeah. Oh, that was amazing.
Really fun to work on. I love Kevin Bailey and Ryan Tudhope, the 2 owners of the company. The company's now gone, but they're still doing very well.
So tell me about the work that what you love to do, because you have concept art, you have matte paintings, and you also do visual effect art direction. So how did that all come about? I mean, what was your background that led you to Hollywood and to these jobs and working on these huge movies?
So I guess when I was I'll tell you the whole story. So in high school, I would go back and forth between art and music. And I actually went to UC Santa Cruz to be a music major. And I was I was in high school was singing in a group with a guy named Deke Sharon, who ended up being the musical director for the Pitch Perfect movies.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh, cool.
Yeah, and we were in a quartet together, and he kind of ran us, and we sang the national anthem at a Giants game, and it was just great fun. Would sing at parties, and so. But then I also had this fascination with artwork, and I was a huge Star Wars fan, and so earlier in high school, I kind of thought, well, maybe I'll be an artist. So I got into UC Santa Cruz, and was in the music program. And then there was this weird time, I guess it was freshman year, where I just felt like it was sort of like an awkward first year in college. And I decided, I just need to focus on something. So I thought, I'm going to learn to paint like those matte painters. And I literally just made it a goal, and I just started painting. And after about, I guess that summer, I went to a talk on Willow, where, the Lucasfilm movie. And I walked up and Craig Barron was giving a talk. And he and Mike Pangrazio owned Matt World Digital. So that ended up leading to a first summer job at ILM. I think they were leaving ILM and starting Matt World, but I ended up getting kind of picked up. I sent him some letters and they ended up at ILM. And then I went and worked there on The Burbs. It was the first movie I'd worked on.
Wow.
And I was kind of like a bucket boy, right? Like cleaning brushes and helping with some of the painting. But it also gave me a chance to see all the full-size matte paintings. And I was just totally blown away by them. So after having that summer experience, I knew what I needed to focus on. I went back to school and I spent another year practicing painting. And then the following summer, I took time off school and got a job at Matte World doing matte painting. So I had about 3 years working under Mike Pangrazio, and he's one of the, I guess in that generation, one of the most well-known matte painters. He did the shot at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, cool. Okay.
He did just the most iconic matte paintings I can think of, or many of the most.
But wait. So how do you go from, you say to yourself, I really want to learn everything there is about art. I wish it was that easy. There'd be a lot of languages I would like to learn. But you must have had some, instinct or some experience. Is that right? As a kid?
So, it's weird. I always, matte painting, of course, are these realistic paintings that when you step back, they look real, you know? And even as a little kid, I remember watching a Brady Bunch episode where the dad, who's an architect, had this illustration. And I thought, wow, I bet he has these pens that make it so you can draw like photographs. And so for whatever reason, I was drawn to this idea of photorealistic painting.
Okay.
And so it was certainly a fascination. And that was even as a young kid. And I, like probably 8 years old, and I would sit there and draw quite a bit. So I think I always had this, I would look at these paintings and I was just so drawn to the fact that they were painted, but they looked real. And this led to ultimately a love of, I love photorealism, but ultimately what I learned in my career is it's more about impressionism, a little bit less photorealism. That the best work is this impression, and it reads quickly and it tells the story. And it does look real, but I would say that the best realists are having an impressionistic ability, right? Because it just sort of mimics how your eyes focus on what's important. So a lot of it is like how lighting is telling the story.
Right.
And so I was really drawn to that. So I guess when I have this awkward moment in college, I'm just like, I need to focus on something just to get my head out of this, first year. And it ended up leading to a job, and I ended up, it's a little bittersweet because I kind of gave up music. I realized I needed to focus on one thing. And to this day, I miss music.
Right.
But it was its own kind of, for me, a success story. And then as time went on, I'd say, every painter has their specialty. And mine ended up being mood and lighting. Yeah. And I think and my pieces would tend to make you feel like you're someplace that's sort of a story moment, right? And I would draw upon things that I remembered, clouds or just atmospheric things that I thought were beautiful, and kind of incorporate those in the paintings.
Well, that's why I loved your work so much, because you had the light and the mood, but you were able to make what were fantasy worlds feel real, as if you could go to that place. And I did a lot of school events, And I would often tell kids, I said, oh, you can go there. If you want to go to the chessboard desert, you just have to go down the 405. And when you hit the 101, go right. And then there's a street over. And they're like, what? I go, yeah, it's a real place. And the artwork, it draws you in from that standpoint. It doesn't, not all, a lot of the fantasy work, you feel it's fantasy, but, but your specialty is or was environments, right? That's
it always was. And as time went on, I pushed my work more towards conceptual work, like concept paintings, instead of map paintings, right? So that was the work that I ended up doing with Doug. But when I started with interacting with Doug, I was doing map paintings at ILM.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So, but it led to this role of doing concept paintings, environment.
And did you ever imagine that you would be working on movies like, Blade Runner 2049 or Star Wars or The Matrix or... you've worked on iconic.
Oddly, I did.
You did?
I was really driven when I wanted to be a map painter. I was just thought I'm going to work on the next Star Wars movie, and this is in college.
Wow.
And I had this kind of nervous drive, like I can't fail because I had good parents and they always supported me. There's no reason, someone's got to do it, right? So there's no reason I can't do it. And I just had that ambition at that age.
So what you're saying is if you have good parents, people don't fail?
I think people,
I'm teasing you.
I know you are, but I'm going to answer it.
Anyway, go ahead.
Failure is part of it, right? Like you have your ups and your downs for sure, but you have these moments where you succeed, just to be followed by a failure.
Yeah, I do actually love that because I had great parents, but my dad talked about failure, and that failure was such a big part of life, and encouraged failure because it would open a door for something unexpected, and that license to make mistakes was fundamental to me deciding to try and write a book, as you made a fundamental choice to go into map painting. You need that support, and I think that's one of the most moving things a parent can do is this unbridled support that we are there with you. So I get that for sure.
Yeah, I remember. I wasn't always a good map painter. In other words, I always tell aspiring artists, it's like you have to be willing to be bad at something in order to ultimately be good.
Yeah, you got to write a lot of bad sentences, a lot of bad paragraphs, a lot of bad chapters, and a lot of bad manuscripts.
Yeah. It's really true.
So, because I think listeners like to get the inside view sometimes of artists' work on projects. Can we just go through a few of the projects that I'm not familiar with what you would have done on Blade Runner 2049, but it's such a beautiful movie. It's just stunning. I'm just curious, what they brought you in on that movie for.
Yeah, there was this. I was sort of the company art director, and so I would be in dailies making comments and just making lighting suggestions and stuff. And then more specifically, we also brought in a concept artist named Mark Cabana, who's an amazing designer drawer. Mm-hmm. And we have worked together off and on, with Doug in the past. And that's where I met Mark. And he was working up at Lucasfilm when I was working at ILM. So I was sort of working on his designs. For the Gunga scene in Star Wars, for example, he had drawn it, and then I ended up re-envisioning it as a real thing. So on Blade Runner, we had the primary area we worked on was outside of BB's Bar, which is sort of an adult exterior scene. And I've forgotten the main character's name, not Deckard, but the Ryan Gosling character meets a woman there. and it's adult theme. There's like adult vending machines, and we had to design those. And it was all shot on stage, and so we had to envision an expansive environment around this set. So it was coming up with high-rise skyscrapers and signage and this very atmospheric scene. And then we did multiple views in that environment. So it was sort of a combination for me of I didn't do any specific matte painting, but as the company would build the virtual set, then I would take that and do a painting on top and then hand it back to them, and then they would take it further. We would kind of go back and forth. So I was really like a visual effects art director in that regard. So I didn't do anything that was actually physically in the film, but I did a lot of designs, or I think this is how we should light the scene, or this is how we should make this scene look.
It's so interesting because I don't think people realize how much of a collaboration there is, between the art director and the cinematographer and the director to come up with that look and feel. I'm curious because I worked with Rupert Sanders. We were developing. He's a director that you would have worked with on Ghost in the Shell, right? So he was such a visualist. I loved his mind. We were working on a similar project to Ghost in the Shell, which never happened at Warner Brothers. And so he left to go do Ghost in the Shell, which I swear some of the concepts that were in our movie made it into his movie. But I really appreciate that his talent. So I'm curious, because that was big, again, a big sci-fi project. Did you do something similar on that film, or?
It was sort of similar. I think that came through our company pretty quickly. I want to say we were on it for about 6 weeks. I remember. I think there was another, I forget which studio had it, and then we did some work to help them out, kind of thing. But I worked primarily on the scene where they're out, Scarlett Johansson and another character on a boat out in the water.
Okay.
And the cityscape is behind them.
Okay.
So it was sort of the same kind of capacity, though, coming up with how tall are the buildings, and like what is what are the 3D signage? What are they doing, and what's the composition?
Right.
So similar thing, and then that would get passed back. Like the director would say, "Yep, that's it," and then the company would kind of make it, or duplicate it.
So, since this is an All Things Alice podcast, I do want to ask you about the My Alice and Wonderland world and what you recall. I recall one of the first concepts you did might have been the Pool of Tears, but you had Alice with a rabbit in a like a little, almost like a teacup. And we morphed from that to the Pool of Tears. I can't remember the order because you did like one thing that you worked really hard on that you nailed was the Valley of Mushrooms.
Right, and then was that the one that became a book cover, or I think maybe we did a couple times. We did a few iterations of.
Yeah, that became the British book cover.
Yeah, it was like a soft cover book, right?
The paperback. Yeah.
Really fun. I mean, I have this thing about mushrooms. Like, I just love. I don't know why, but for some reason they're just magical and interesting and otherworldly.
Well, they're very popular these days. So, magic mushrooms. You did a lot of interesting mushroom concepts before we landed on the sort of the bigger, larger version of the top, so that Alice and Dodge could be escaping. I think that's one of them, and it was a horizontal image. And then you did a vertical image later, which really showed the scope of the Valley of Mushrooms. And and that was and you really just nailed the lighting. So because you're into mushrooms, did you go into nature to come up with
I did a bit. I tend to look at a lot of reference. Like I'll, look at National Geographic, and nowadays you'd search online to find imagery. But I also like to just get the camera and go out and just take pictures
Oh, okay.
to be inspired. And then I think I may have also sculpted some stuff and lit them and photographed them just to get lighting ideas
For the Valley
for
of
the
Mushrooms?
Yeah, just some simple shapes. So, I used to do that a lot as well. And now you would do it in 3D and light it, in a game engine or in a 3D package. But back then, yeah. But back then, I would often do those types of things, photograph something or try and find something in nature.
I didn't realize that you did sculptures for those environments. I do obviously vividly remember the Bibwit Hart character, and I'm guessing, but it seemed like there was 50 variants on your sculptures. And I said, are you sure that you want to do these sculptures? And, because it seemed like it was really time consuming. And he goes, no, I want to do it. This is my process. But I think you wanted to do it because we had done almost exclusively environments, and you were itching to do some. I think I might have said, what are you interested in doing? He goes, I'd like to do some characters.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And for me, it was a good way to feel out the shape and to come up with something that I felt, that character was, and I think I gave him the ears to tie him in with the rabbit character, but I can't remember if he's supposed to in the story or not. But that's what I was sort of, imagining. And so I was like, well, he's got to look intelligent. He's got to look. I thought of him as kind of like a Leonardo da Vinci character in a way.
Okay. Okay.
And sort of somewhere between an artist and a philosopher, and so it was great. It was really fun, and it's funny. I look back at that piece, and even though it's not exactly what I would do now, I still like what I came up with at the time. And I think for me, sculpting was an easier way for me to find the character.
Well, for our listeners, I'm going to include some images of the sculptures on the blog. I'll do a little interview version of this, and so I can share a lot of the artwork that we're talking about, so people will be able to see it. Because we did start with Bibwit, and the description you just described, was what you started with, and it ended up the first image that you did was like a very like a professor. It was this beautiful image. But he didn't have those large ears, and because Bibwit was an anagram of White Rabbit, and the way that Alice would have described Bibwit to Lewis Carroll is why he changed it to White Rabbit. So he had really big ears because he had remarkable hearing, and I remember sort of making that note. I
remember the first drawing. Now that you mention it, I remember the first one
with the beard, and
he does have pretty big ears, the human ears.
And it turned out that I loved that image, and I think I might have used that as Alice's dad, King Nolan, because he was very regal, but he wasn't a different species, and so that's when you jumped into the the sculpture, and I was really nervous because I'm like, well, wait, this is going to take a long time. So you were working, you had a full-time job, and you seem like, I think you were working weekends. And I used to say, I have people who work on weekends and they have sugar daddy jobs. And so I do the best I can and I take what I can get. But that turned out great. And I love, and then the way that, remember the last thing you put was the globe. It was sort of.
I forget if he's got his hand on it or something, but I think it was pretty much right out of a Vermeer painting. The same, Vermeer always has. It looks like something that character would have, right?
Yeah. And then, there's certain images that are in every presentation and every meeting or every school event because they're part of the mythology. So, the Pool of Tears, sets the story in motion when our heroes are separated. So I'm constantly showing that. The Valley of Mushrooms just speaks to people that know Alice in Wonderland. It's iconic and it's just a twist, which you did beautifully. The Everlasting Forest was something, invented. And I wanted that to be very vivid and as if it was from the rainforest, so that the colors were all popping and our heroes have to transverse through there. And that, I think, is my favorite image that you did for me. It was so spectacular. I really want people to see it because you'll see our heroes, but it really does feel like a real place.
And it's funny. It's funny too because I feel like even when I look at that piece now, I really like it, and it's indicative of something I would do now. Like I wouldn't redo it. Like I think it's just fine. And I went through a big transition of like when I came out of ILM and was at the orphanage, I really wanted to do concept art, but I was still a matte painter in a way. Like my skill set was erasing all signs of illustration, right? And so matte paintings are supposed to look real. So it took a long time to get a feel for creating images that had an illustrated look, but yet were still realistic and interesting. And I feel like, that piece was sort of one from around the era where, and it was probably later when we were working maybe like 2008, like you had mentioned. And I felt like I really was beginning to really get that look, like I'm like, oh, nice. It looks like an illustration, but it still has some realism, but it's magical as well.
Well, I saw an image that you did for Beowulf that reminded me of that image, which had an iridescent colors. It was the Grendel's Cave. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. That image is very similar to the Everlasting Forest. That a vivid world with iridescent colors coming out. That was a great. How was that movie to work on?
Oh, it was fantastic.
Really?
Yeah, I loved it. I loved that whole time period.
Tell us why. What was it like to collaborate?
Well, it was. So I was working with Doug Chang, and he had started Ice Blink Studios, which eventually turned into Image Movers Digital, and it was just a team of the best artists in each category. There was Dermot Power was there. He was a great character designer. Kurt Kaufman was a good designer as well, just of hardware, and Mark Cabana was there. So I was exposed to just a wonderful art department. It was, it was one of my favorite periods of my career. It was just, I got to paint all day and just worked on becoming better and was just given assignments, and it was just perfect, and there were experts in every category. So if I was like, God, how do I solve this problem? Everyone was very sharing, and it was like a great place to learn because of that environment. And I felt Doug was a really good leader. So it was a sweet spot, and the industry changed, and I haven't experienced anything quite that fun since. Like that was just such a sweet spot, And since then, like managing teams and being an art director, I do enjoy it, but I think it was sort of a luxury just to put a learning hat on and just be passionate about painting.
Let me ask you, when you collaborate, what are the things that are the most helpful? So if you're coming up with something, for instance, if we're talking about something from my book, was it the reading of the material? Is it the conversations about kind of the look and the feel? Because I know that whenever I spoke with you, I never felt like I had quite the right language. I was really trying to find the language to describe it. And often I would say, well, it's in the book, but it could be this or that. But you would bring, your own take to it, which is what I always wanted. I said, look, I want you to do your thing. So how do you translate what's on the page, what somebody's saying, what an art director, what a director's saying, to trusting the process?
I think there was something I learned maybe when I was at Matt World at the beginning of my career, about year 2.5. And I suddenly realized I kept trying to copy all these other map painters, right? And and then it sort of dawned on me, oh, wait a second, I just need to make something that I think is beautiful. Mm-hmm. And it was a big discovery, because once I realized it was sort of finding my vision, my work just improved immensely. And I think some of that's about confidence. I just realized it was kind of like a treasure hunt for me to find something that really stuck with me. Mm-hmm. And so I would and then the second part of that is just exposing yourself to reference, like looking and looking and looking and looking until you find something evocative. And it might be a completely different subject matter, but there'll be a clue as to the success of this image you're going to make,
Well, I bring it up because a lot of the images that we've talked about already that you and I worked on, they came out fully formed almost. There was some lighting and color choices. And I remember in the Chessboard Desert, we added Red's lair in the background. But one of the things that we worked on was the Whispering Woods. And you did a lot of concepts, and it was really interesting. But it was at the bottom of the tree, and there were this huge trunk with big roots and
right,
and I was like, well, I don't know. I thought it was more from the top down that would create a canopy so that our heroes be running, and then the top branches would come down and then whisper,
Mm-hmm.
and that's basically all I had.
And I never quite finished that piece either, right?
Well, we have a version that's pretty good that I did use, but didn't pop in the same way. We also did one about the iron butterfly, which was a concept that I can't even remember if it made it into the book. But we have partial, and I used it occasionally. But some of those were not finished, and I was just having such a good time working with you. I could have had the whole thing done. I just couldn't afford to do the whole thing. But it was
and it was really fun back then. Just to doodle and kind of make little sketches and come up with ideas and stuff.
So do you, I saw online that you teach a class, a master class, or you might have at some point for map painting?
That was one presentation, and it was more like explaining my whole career and my influences as a kid.
Oh, okay.
I sort of started with, riding bikes and being imaginative as a kid and dreaming and all this kind of stuff, and took that all the way through my career with images and stuff. And so it was sort of it was a talk like that. I just showed all my work, and it was really fun. But I have yet to do a class, sort of a how-to type thing.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe one day.
Well, I mean, two things that you brought up. One, the joy of creating and then turning that creativity into a job. That's pretty amazing. And then, how does somebody else figure all that out if they're as ambitious and have good parents as you do? and want to work in the movie business. I'm not sure anybody should be working in the movie business right now. It's
hard. It's hard.
tricky.
I would just say it's hard to know also where things lead, because you could start by thinking that's where you're going to go, but everything is changing so quickly now that it's hard to say what entertainment's going to be, right?
Yeah. And so many of the artists that I know who I worked with, they would do work for Magic of the Gathering because they needed concepts constantly to that thing's been going on for decades, and so that was a place for people to learn, presumably. Not that they have a lot of great artists, but they get paid to do that. So, have you ever done anything for Magic at the Gathering out of curiosity?
Yeah, but I've had a lot of friends that have, do a couple cards here or there.
So let's talk about Alice in Wonderland, and I usually ask folks their first introduction to Alice in Wonderland, and I was curious if what your introduction, and if there are any of the artists who have worked on books or the art itself or the book or the movies worked their way into influences in any of the work that you've done.
Absolutely. So, the original one was just the Disney movie, and I think I saw that at the Sequoia Theater in Mill Valley when I was, I don't know how old, but I must have been between 4 and 7. Somewhere in that time period, and they probably had a showing. And so that was my first memory of it.
In a movie theater, that's very unusual.
In the theater, but I think it was like they showed it for a weekend or something.
Bringing it back. Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's like, and I just remember, something about just the otherworldliness of it, like her falling inside the hole and then all the objects. And it was just very magical, like I just love that. I love that feeling. And then I did much later, I found this book, which is amazing. And this was by a Disney artist, but I don't believe they used this particular person's work.
It was hard to see the
David Hall.
David Hall. Okay. And it's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it's an illustrated. David Hall did the illustrations.
Yes, but I think this is all developed for Disney. In other words, he did some of these illustrations for one of the Disney films, and they're just amazing, amazing sketches.
Okay, I don't know those. Wow.
Yeah, and I think it's the best stuff I've seen. It's like the best Alice in Wonderland imagery that I've seen for me. Like the pictures just really. And I look at them just because they're these great storytelling frames. So when I want to get inspired, sometimes I'll pull this book out and I'll just look through it to kind of get some ideas.
Well, we'll definitely want to share some of those some of those images, because I love seeing all the different artists that have used Alice and did interpretations of Alice. It's pretty amazing.
And then another really influential movie was Dream Child.
Oh, right. Dream Child.
Yeah, and I love that movie. And I saw it. I think I was a junior or senior in high school, and it had Jim Henson's puppets. But it was about Alice Little being invited by Princeton to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Lewis Carroll's birthday.
Yeah,
and it's intermixed with her being kind of haunted by their relationship. And
the story, because I know that movie pretty well. The story is Alice Little, who was the muse for Lewis Carroll, supposedly. When she got married to a man, Mr. Hargraves, I forget his first name. And so when she was Alice Hargraves, and when she was 80, she was invited to the U.S., and she took a ship over to give a speech. And in the movie, she was going to America to give a speech to celebrate Lewis Carroll. And there was a young girl with her. And so then there were these flashbacks about her time with Lewis Carroll, and the flashbacks were all about his book, and there were puppets, like the Mock Turtle, and they were all puppets, and so it was very interesting and weird, and it was an exploration of her relationship with Lewis Carroll because of the suggested sexual undertones of the relationship, right? I mean,
that was certainly part of it. Sort of the inappropriate nature of it, and her trying to grapple with what was positive in that, and maybe what was negative, and how to kind of process it. She was kind of haunted with that.
Yeah.
And then also she was haunted in the story. She was haunted by her own age. So the characters would appear telling her that she's old.
Right. The character is from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.
Yeah. Which I just found that very interesting. And I tend to like movies that are like this, where they kind of use fantasy to work on some pretty serious issues. Like, it's fascinating.
Yeah, people should check it out. It's I think it was in 1985, and there's a very funny. I don't know if you know this. There's a connection between that movie, George Lucas, and Star Wars. Do you know what it is? What?
Rick McCallum was the producer.
He was the producer, and he met George Lucas on that production.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And George Lucas asked him to produce the Young Indiana Jones series, which was really successful. And then he asked him to do Star Wars, and then he became the head of production for Lucasfilms.
Yeah.
So I find that small world that this is an influence of yours. Yeah. And, you ended up working with, you must have known and worked with him, with Rick, because.
A bit. Yeah. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. So, and I think that movie went on and won 3 BAFTA awards or something like that. So
and what I really loved about it was the mood in the scenes. I'm in the Mock Turtle scene in the beginning. It's like the opening of the movie, and it's just very mysterious, and the lighting was very moody, and it's right up my alley, and it really feels like a dream.
And it gets that, to your point, it's established in that opening scene.
Yes.
Jim Henson's Creature Shop did a great job with the makeup and the creature effects, and all of the puppets were based on Tennille's artwork, so the original artist, which I did not know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, so I'm really curious to see the book the Disney book, because I'm a huge Ralph Steadman fan, and I also love Salvador Dali's, crazy psychedelic version of Alice. Mm-hmm. And then there's Barry Moser. Now, Barry Moser did something, I think, in the 70s, and just in terms of what's trending these days, he is in an exhibit in France on all things Alice. So any book illustrators or paintings or map paintings and stuff, and he's one of the only Americans that's included in this this exhibit that's going on right now. So it's been 150 odd plus years. It doesn't stop. It just keeps right on rolling along. So
there's something about that dreamy quality that this one story really captures, right? Like, and I was thinking about that. I was thinking just about how with dreams, in hindsight, a dream is every bit as real as what you did yesterday, right? If you have a dream and you wake up the next day,
absolutely,
they're as real as each other. So I just think that whole part of our experience, like formulating ideas while we're asleep, and I just think it's like really important in the way that you the way that you connect the dots between different parts of your lives and imagination.
I had a lot of experiences with that when I was writing my books, especially the first book, because I had so much anxiety, which is why I couldn't tell anybody that I was writing the book, because I just didn't want people asking me questions. But the anxiety would come out in my dreams, and either I was solving a problem, like a story problem that I had written myself into a corner, or I was having, nightmare, terrors, these terrible dreams because it was going to be so terrible, this book, and so I really experienced that firsthand in the writing of the first book.
I've had very similar experiences. Like, I think being creative is a little, you're confronted by your fears a lot, right?
Right.
And you push through it and try and make something. But I remember this specifically. I was at Matte World. I was maybe matte painting for a year, and it was so hard. And I was doing such a bad job initially. Like, it was just torture because I wanted to be like one of the best, and I just wasn't anywhere close. Like, I was having the hardest time. And my boss Pangrazio would tell me to paint like him, and it wasn't working. And like, I couldn't lock on to a process. And so there was this one painting for Dracula, and it just was an abomination. Like, it was supposed to be the castle, And I was reading all these self-help books. There's a book called The Road Less Traveled.
Yes. Oh my God.
I read it, and I love that book actually. And in it, he talks about grace, right?
Grace. Oh yeah.
He talks about praying for grace. And I literally was just like, please, somebody help me figure out how to turn this around, And then in the middle of the night, I just had a flash of an image, and I woke up and I got it. I'm like, that's it. I got it.
Yeah.
And it was remembering something I had shot when I was at UC Santa Cruz. It was a picture, and it just flashed in my head. And it became a great painting. And then everything else I did in the film ended up being really good. But it was a turning point because it went through this phase of I was just failing,
Right. Yeah, no, that snapping of the fingers, if only that happened more often.
Yeah, but I think there is something about what you're saying about how when you're asleep and you're processing and you're going through your card catalog of everything, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's really, it's really satisfying when you wake up and you know exactly what to do. And if you have a night terror and, you have to take the day off and, get that confidence back. I always like to go finish something that I knew what it was going to be so that I could start the morning very productive and not have to stare at the blank page. So that was a trick that I would use. And often, to your point about I needed that inspiration to solve mostly concept ideas, like logic and because you're creating a whole world and like why does this make sense? And you can't, no one's going to suspend disbelief with that terrible idea. So I like you were describing earlier about some of the artwork that you feel you would do this, that you really you think is great right now and you wouldn't change it, like the Everlasting Forest. And then there's others that you want to change. And so it's the same thing with writing. Right. It's like, wow, that whole chapter, that idea was so stupid. I wish I could go back because I've changed it for the movie version. The movie version is better idea. It makes more sense in terms of what I was working on. So, well, tell me about the gig you have right now and what you're excited about, because you work at Evil Eye Pictures. Is that where you're at, right?
Yeah, still doing that. And I've got a team of artists, small team, and we sort of build out the environments for it's working in the Unreal game engine. We do cinematics for Fortnite. So,
oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm really doing right now is using this time as a time to learn how to work in the engine because it's a great way to work. It's been great fun to collaborate with those guys.
So one of the questions I like to ask guests is, if you were a character from Alice in Wonderland, who would you be and why?
Yeah, so I thought about that just this morning, and I think I would say Alice, and specifically because of her arc going to England and having that be an extremely good representation of the artistic struggle.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You have the magic, and then do you have the magic?
And then you lose it. Right.
You lose it, and then you get it back.
So that's my Alice, because that's what happened in my stories. In the original stories, if you were watching Dream Child or something, do you have a version from Lewis Carroll's that comes to mind?
Yeah, probably none where I identify with any of the characters, But I would say, again, because she's sort of passing through the story and experiencing all the dreaming and all these different, I still feel mostly like that character. I mean, I'd like to fancy myself as a Bibwit, I think,
Okay.
he's an interesting character, or the caterpillar is interesting because they're sort of mystical and have vast knowledge, and I think that's really intriguing.
Right.
There's different things I like about all these characters. But I still really identify with kind of, every day and every night I literally try and, dream and try and have like an experience as I'm falling asleep. I'm kind of like, here it goes. Like my brain's starting to do that thing. Like you start seeing little things and, the little stories start to come out of it.
Right. Right.
And so I'm fascinated with that whole, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more and more fascinated by that.
Well, no wonder you like Dream Child so much. And, I do think you can cultivate a stronger dream experience by, setting intention on, I want to dream, and I want to remember my dreams, and I want to go in this place, and I want to, as long as you set an intention, I find that can be helpful, especially if you're right in the middle of something creative, not something filled with anxiety. So, like the pandemic, my dreams did not work out on the creative side during some of the crazy pandemic.
Hard to be creative.
So
you're stressed about stuff like that.
I've really appreciated chatting and revisiting your art that I've been living with every day since you created it. And so to be able to touch base and talk on this podcast has been really meaningful. So thank you, Brian, for sharing your insight and your experience. I think people are going to enjoy listening.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's really nice to catch up.
Hey, I just love your work. Just absolutely loved our collaboration, and it was a pleasure to chat. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thanks for taking time to chat with us and sharing your experiences. So,
thanks, Frank. It's great to see you. Nice talking to you.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.